Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me to come to Palermo. It's a great pleasure to be here. I will be speaking on a theme that, or a question that I think has no discipline. I mean, it is not the kind of question or theme that you can approach and you can properly study from a single disciplinary point of view. And I think that this might give us something useful to think about and to discuss, given that we all come from slightly different disciplinary backgrounds. And at the same time, it will give me the opportunity to present some work I've been doing in recent years in the context of a NERC research program, funded research program, looking at the ways of the hand and the process of creativity in the context of ceramics and pottery making. So it is often claimed, both by researchers and skilled practitioners, that making is a dialogue between maker and material. This statement seems to capture a basic characteristic of making as a relational process. But what does it mean? What kind of dialogue is that? The trouble here is that in this presumed dialogical interaction between the maker and the material, no one is actually talking to each other. Acts of making are famous for how little use they make of language. If there is indeed a dialogue, it is not verbal. It makes no use of words. Any true conversation between maker and material must be expressed through different sensory modalities. Sound and hearing, visual resonance, feel, touch, and tactility are some of the most prominent candidates. For instance, one may see the foundation of this dialogue in the capacity of attentive listening. Or one could follow the anthropologist Tim Ingold and see making as a process of correspondence, as he calls it, in which sentient practitioners and active materials continually answer to one another in the generation of form. In this lecture, drawing primarily, as I said, on my ongoing anthropological study of pottery making in Greece, I will attempt to clarify and, if possible, to demystify the meaning of this powerful metaphor of a dialogue between maker and material. I will try to show how a focus on the temporality of touch and the tactility of making can help us disambiguate this non-discursive dialogue between maker and material. I will follow the ways of the hand as it moves with clay and ask about the agency and experience of touch. What touching does, who is doing the touching, what is touched, and how it is touched. My basic proposal is the following. With increasing levels of skill, tactile perception plays an active role in transforming a mere kinetic interaction between the potter and the clay into a multimodal kinesthetic transaction. In the former case, that of kinetic interaction, potter and clay causally respond to each other. In the latter case, that of kinesthetic transaction, the potter becomes attentive to the expressive affordances of clay, and recursively, the clay becomes responsive to the creative affordances of the potter's hand. I call this situational attunement between the potter and clay haptic attentive unity. I will suggest and discussed later on, two major ways that haptic attentive unity can be understood. First, I would like to make a brief note on my methodology. The approach we adopt in the Handmade project to study the process of making is multimodal and comparative. We employ and develop a process-oriented methodology called perspectival kinesthetic imaging. Perspectival kinesthetic imaging is a method designed to facilitate the anthropological study of craft through the assemblage and juxtaposition of multitude viewpoints on the process of making. This perspectival juxtaposition is made possible by a combination of multimodal visual captures, in our case, photography, video, observational drawing, and mobile eye tracking. Each of these multimodal visual captures affords a distinctive perspective from which we identify and observe events of interest, namely creative gestures, which form the basic question of this project. Multimodal visual captures are set and employed in the context of multi-sited participatory observation. Moreover, we incorporate phenomenological interviewing combined with photo and video elicitation, as well as interaction and semiotic analysis. Now, our study follows the principles of material engagement theory, which proposes a radical continuity between thinking and making. The material engagement approach can be described by means of three major working hypotheses, each one targeting a different but complementary aspect of human becoming, namely cognition, signification, and agency. So we have the hypothesis of the extended mind, which basically argues that many processes that we tend to classify as cognitive or mental and prefer to localize inside the head are better described as distributed processes extending beyond the individual into the socio-material environment. An active signification is a second hypothesis, which essentially proposed that the meaning of things is not the product of symbolic representation, but of an action. Material signs bring forth rather than simply represent, preform concepts. And last, the hypothesis of material agency, which basically states that agency is not a human property, but the emergent product of situated activity. What an entity is in itself does not really matter. What does matter is what it becomes and where it stands inside a community of action and material engagement. So from the perspective of material engagement theory, thinking is in the making, or else making is a form of thinking. Mind and matter form a unity. Keeping this theoretical background in mind, I turn now to haptic attentive unity and the dialogue between potter and clay. When potters are asked to describe clay or their relation with this material, expressions like clay is alive, I become one with clay, and clay speaks to me are very common. Ceramists are not alone in doing this, namely in seeing life and agency where other people cannot. It is common for the skilled craft person to perceive the animate qualities and creative habits of the tools and materials that define their practices and skills. Different crafts and materials have their own affordances and morphogenetic potentials, as well as capacities for expression and communication. That applies to all materials, digital or traditionally physical materialities like the one of clay we've been discussing. Of course, the potter's descriptions and subjective self-assessments about the experience of making and the qualities of clay cannot be taken at face value. They do not constitute theoretical descriptions or explanations of why clay moves or behaves the way it does. Still, these sentences do represent how the people who actually work with clay and know it better choose to speak about their experiences and should not be dismissed as merely things that people say. As I came to know firsthand, working for many years and with many potters, these are the people who know clay from the inside, which means that clay is part of what they are. They are both skilled makers and concerned observers who spend their lives constantly learning and experiencing the plasticity of this material. This does not mean, however, that the potter's explanations are necessarily the best explanations, or that there is a simple way to separate one description as being more accurate than another. The potters often see distinctions where others see continuity, and continuity where others see difference. They often unite things that our analytical predisposition may wish to keep separate, but they may also divide things that we seek to unite in our analysis. Naturally, neither the potter nor the anthropologist in themselves have the final authority to decide what is the best description or interpretation of the life, agency, or language of clay. Instead, they are both partners in an exploratory process by which they combine skills and exchange knowledge and ways of seeing. Participatory analysis and methodologies like that of kinesthetic imaging we employ in the Handmade project are the products of this synergy of technical and analytical perspectives. If you make that move, and as I'll explain below some of the theoretical preconditions for that, it becomes clear that the proposed life of clay is not a matter of metaphoric language or of misattribution of agency. On the contrary, it is the product of education of attention and attentive material engagement. So to give you one simple example, when the two potters that you see depicted in the slide, Kostas the Pastas and Antonis Achonius from the island of Sifnos, describe their local clay as alive, they do not simply use a figure of speech in order to add emphasis in the narrative, nor do they, as some psychologists are inclined to believe, when confronted with similar animistic behaviors, misuse the human capacity for social intelligence, projecting life and agency to something which has clearly none, namely clay. If the potters in our example come to think that the clay is alive, is not because they are childishly somehow misguided to animate matter. Rather, their ability to experience the animacy of clay is simply the product of their increased sensitivity and responsiveness to the affordances of this material, to the affordances of clay. It is that feeling of and for clay that allows them also sometimes to imagine for real, if I may borrow a term by Tim Ingold. The more skilled the potters become, the more possibilities for the generation of form and material imagination will be forced upon their attention. The active use of animate language serves to emphasize this vitality and multimodality of clay. Whatever term one may use to describe the exchange of energies between potter and clay, it cannot be one that presupposes subjects and objects. Rather, it has to be one that expresses their mutual becoming in form making. Centering clay on the wheel is recognizably the most basic and difficult techniques in pottery making. It is the foundation for throwing and form making. It essentially involves the skilled positioning of clay in between two major forces, the kinetic force of the spinning wheel and the kinesthetic force of the potter's hands. The success of centering will facilitate or limit the creative transaction between the potter and clay. Now, there are two major ways to describe and account for that process. The one we may call representational or interactional, and the second we may call performative or transactional. Put it simply, the main difference between the two accounts is the following. According to the representational or interactional account of centering, it is the potter who is attuning his or her body with the clay. By contrast, according to the performative or transactional account, it is the act of centering that is attuning the potter's body with clay. I advocate for the primacy of material engagement and thus for the latter view. But let us take a closer look on what both views actually imply. We begin with a representational, interactional view. The obvious way to describe what's happening during centering is to look at it as a causal, sequential interaction between potter and clay. This description conveniently presupposes the existence of two well-defined and separate entities, namely potter and clay. These two entities are active, and one active and the other passive, are given in advance of the creative process and are interacting only during the actual process of making when the potter is acting on clay. This implies a clear direction of causality, namely action is caused by the potter's brain or body as a succession of isolated moments in time. The separation of the potter from clay, of the subject from the object, also answers the question of agency, namely, who is the author of the doing? Clearly, it must be the potter who imposes form on clay. This is, of course, an oversimplified version of a complicated and heavily contested story of creative agency. Still, the underlying message, or ontology, if you prefer, is clear. Thinking, that's the assumption, takes place inside the head and simply uses the hand to execute the necessary movements that will allow the mind to act on matter. Sensible and intuitive this representational description as it may seem, we have good reasons to suggest that it is not the most accurate way to describe the coming together of potter and clay. The discussed representational account, although well embedded in the dominant cognitivist ontology of contemporary psychology and cognitive science, fails to explain and misrepresents, in my view, what happens when our potters actually engage with clay. Two major and related shortcomings are especially relevant for my argument here. First, the misrepresentation of temporality in the sense of duration as chronology. And second, the misrepresentation of hylonoetic, and this is a term from the Greek hili for matter and noises for intelligence. So we have this misrepresentation of hylonoetic consciousness as bodily subjectivity. Taken together, those major shortcomings are responsible for misconceiving the temporal co-constitution of potter and clay for a mere sequential causal interaction between them. Which brings us to the second performative or transactional view of centering I mentioned. Look at the gestures depicted in this slide. Although they may seem to represent sequential phases in the making of the pot, They are by no means discrete or separated. Creative gestures do not just follow one another in time. Rather, it is carried over in the next as a path of movement along a line of clay. In other words, the temporality of pottery making is durational in the Bergsonian sense. As was pointed out, the basic contribution of centering in pottery making is to establish the necessary material ecology which it will allow the aims, intentions, or plans of the potter to align with the agency and affordances of the materials and the tools involved. The success of making as an emergent performance depends on that basic purposeful alignment that the act of centering makes possible. In this connection, an important point about centering that I wish to highlight, as it is often misrepresented, is the following. It is not the potter that is centering the clay, rather, it is the process of centering that allows the movements of the potter, the clay, and the wheel to form a temporal alliance, establishing the possibility of a meaningful dialogue. This is also why centering, at least a successful one, implies an odd sense of decentering. In particular, the centering of clay necessitates the decentering of the potter's bodily subjectivity. This explains why potters often describe pottery making as a struggle to become one with clay. Touching clay, the potter's hand calls into question the dualism of mind and matter. The common distinction between the knower and known collapse. In the context of material engagement theory, this mode of thinking is referred to as thinking. I use the notion of thinking to articulate the process of thinking and feeling with and through and about material things. As some of you may know, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, in his famous essay, The Thing, uses the same term, namely thinking, to express how things gather space and time. My own use of the term thinking retains this original sense of gathering, but I also diverge from the Heideggerian phenomenological path, emphasizing instead the agency of things in human thinking, or else what I call the cognitive life of things. In any case, the basic premise that I want to communicate through the notion of thinking is very simple. We humans are thinkers. No other animal has been or can be defined as a species on the basis of its relationship with a variety of things and material forms that it makes. We humans are precisely a species of this rather strange sort. Let me explain. I say we are strange not because I deny that other animals are capable of thinking. We know that they are. We know that they create tools and they use tools. And we have a very big variety of species now that can be thought in that way. So anthropocentrism needs to be avoided here. Nor do I say we are strange because I believe that by making things or by thinking through things, we overcome the limits of our nature and enter into a separate cultural realm. No other controversy in the study of human becoming has been more unhelpful, misleading, and sterile than that between nature and culture. There is no moment in the history of human evolution where biology gave way to culture. Human becoming has always been inseparably linked with the developmental contingencies of action. No bodily activity, not even our basic capacity for bipedal locomotion is immune to the situated dynamics of real life ontogenetic development. As the anthropologist Marcel Mauss neatly pointed out in his famous essay on bodily techniques, there is no natural way to move our bodies. But I suggest it would be equally wrong to think of bodily movement as the product of culture. There is no natural or cultural way to move our bodies. Instead, we should think of the acting body as a relational developmental achievement of situated material engagement. So, to give you an example, the body of the potter that we discuss here, entering into the craft of pottery making, working with clay and developing the skills of the job, it becomes more than a body. It becomes situated. What that means is that the body becomes specific and different. It embodies a unique developmental life history. It becomes affected by the physical and psychoactive properties of clay, by the patterns and rhythms of coordination, and by the kinesthetic experience, muscular memories, and skills attached to it. Unlike other human bodies, with no special connection to the act of potting, the potter's body will come to know, with practice and effort, how to touch and feel the clay. The potter's body must be able to reliably and in different conditions identify what kind of actions clay invites or allows and be able to relate to the properties of this material in a way that other human bodies cannot. This is a dynamical process that involves a temporal alliance of specific skills, materials, gestures, and sequences of actions. Now, a common mistake is to see the material elements of practice, in this case, the wheel or the clay, as passive, external influences operating from the outside on the potter's body. In contrast to this separatist view, the material engagement perspective is grounded on the assumption that the relevant material environment becomes incorporated into the body's schema, actively operating inside and through the body. I do not mean that in the discontinuous representational sense, but in the continuous and active sense. It is not the world that is represented on the inside, rather it is the body that is extended on the outside, seeking sources of agency and new paths of self-specification. According to that vision, clay is simultaneously a force of attraction, resistance, and capacity for action. The proposed terminological shift from thinking to thinking help us to escape representationalism and to focus where brain, body, and materiality join forces and exchange properties. Pottery making is now cast in terms of high lonoetic consciousness and material imagination. Understanding those issues often necessitates a great deal of unlearning of our modern habits of thinking. To that end, a useful anthropological analogy I would like to propose is that of the gift. For making, as I will discuss below in more details, is more of a gifting. But first, I would like to focus on the notion of haptic attentive unity. Haptic, yes, as I explained before, relevant to this notion, I adhere to that ecological and active tradition of thought, which holds that the study of making demands an approach which situates skilled practice in the context of material engagement. This is also to recognize the process of making as an attentive transaction with the tools and materials involved. This transaction, which is often described both as a dialogue between the potter and clay and as the unifying experience of becoming one with the clay, is multimodal. Although I emphasize the tactility of making, it needs to be underlined that the state of situational attunement we call haptic attentive unity is cross-modal and extends beyond the point of contact of the hand with the clay. The haptic attentive unity and the related experience of attentive material engagement refers to the whole body in movement with its ways of touching and feeling the clay. The haptic attentive unity expresses the integration of these attentive modes. In particular, there are two major ways that haptic attentive unity can be understood. First, haptic attentive unity denotes the feeling of mindful presence, characteristic of attentive engagement, where the potter's attention is fully absorbed in the action. Second, haptic attentive unity is also associated with the active exploratory use of touch in the handling of clay. That is, the use of touch as a tool of creative material engagement. I will focus on the last. The relation between haptic attentive unity and creative material engagement can be understood as follows. Many times during the process of making, clay is not the object of the potter's tactual experience, but the very medium of an active discovery. Although clay is the material touched by the potter's hand, in specific occurrences of exploratory activity, clay can also be understood as a transparent glove or prosthetic tool that the potter is actively using in order to perceive and to discover. That is, rather than seeing clay as merely providing the content of the potter's tactual experience or perception, clay now becomes a second skin to touch with. The potter senses through this globe of clay the possible counters of form. The material is the prosthesis. The potter's hand then uses and touches the clay, and at the same time is used and touched by the clay. Clay is no longer the passive material upon which form is imposed. Rather, it is an active tool with which the potter perceives, anticipates, imagines, explores, and discovers possibilities of form. The clay is for the potter what the stick is for the blind. Clay is not the object, but the medium of the potter's perception. I suggested that the making of form depends on a haptic exchange between the potter and the relevant material environment. I would like now to explore the meaning of this exchange further, as it can help us understand the dialogical aspect of making. Drawing on Merleau-Ponty's famous example of one hand touching the other, the relationship between the hand and clay could be described as reversible. What that means is that clay perceives the potter's hand as much as the potter perceives clay. But how can clay perceive anything? No doubt, clay forming is a good example of tactual perception or haptic touch. Most researchers would agree that touch is simultaneously active and passive. One cannot touch without being touched. Touching the clay also means being touched by the clay. We all can touch clay, and we all can, to some extent, imagine that we touch clay. But to claim that the clay is actually touching us seems like a step too far. And yet, this is exactly what I would like to suggest. This rare and rather special occurrence, where the clay is actually touching the potter's hand, is precisely what seems to be the distinctive feature of haptic attentive unity. What does this mean? The problem is partly perspectival and partly transactional. As such, its theoretical transposition into the anthropological language of exchange may help us to understand and resolve it. I have suggested that haptic attentive unity, to the extent that is grounded on multimodal exchanges and transactions, resembles a gifting, a form of gifting, of gift exchange. The notion of gift and the process of gifting or gift exchange, that is to give, to receive, and most importantly to reciprocate, is well studied and seem of particular relevance, not the least because of most influential account of the Maori notion of how, the spirit of the gift. What I essentially proposed is that the attentive material engagement resembles in its operation that of gift exchange. I suggest that attention is a gift, that attentiveness is a gifting. To be attentive is to anticipate some form of reciprocation. The notion of attentive material engagement and its culmination in haptic attentive unity motivates the same question that guided most original analysis of the gift in the Tobrian Islands. What force is there in the attention given that makes the recipient give something back? What I borrow from the language of the gift is a way to express the entanglements of attention for which we often lack the vocabulary. Moses' account of the Maori notion of how, as presented in his famous essay, The Gift, speaks also of an intermingling of person and thing. I suggest that as the motion characterization of the spiritual power of the gift is situated in the absence of an absolute differentiation between persons and things, so the attentive power of touch is situated in the absence of an absolute differentiation between the touching and the touched. Of course, gifts are not always reciprocal and necessarily alignable. That is true also for the gift of attention and its complex political economy. The question is this: what force is there in the potter's creative gesture which compels the recipient, namely clay, to make a return, that is, to generate form? I propose that in the case of attention gifts, the gift returns in the form of situational affordances and an active discovery. Technically, this is what we described before as immersive attentive engagement. Attentiveness, or some forms of it, especially attentive engagement in the context of creativity, are inalienable possessions which can never be fully removed from the person who originally owned them. Of course, the meaning of ownership is not very clear in this context. We said that touch is generally understood as the property of the potter's hand. Touching belongs to the hand, like seeing belongs to the eye. But this is not entirely true. Body ownership, in the case of the potter, as in all cases of creative thinking, is negotiable and dissociable from agency. The sense of agency, namely the sense that I am causing my hand to move, and the sense of ownership, namely the sense that it is my hand that is moving, are far from stable during the process of creation, and are completely transformed during the experience of haptic attentive unity. Touch plays a crucial role here. Attention, agency, and ownership are parts of a gift exchange between potter and clay. In the case of making or creative material engagement, the equivalent of gift is form. Form is the gift that travels or the object of exchange between the potter and clay. The haptic attentive unity of clay is the force that sustains this exchange, the force of attentive material engagement. So to conclude, it has long been recognized, notably by the anthropologist Leroy Gourand in Gesture, his famous book Gesture and Speech, that the making of anything is a dialogue between the maker and the material employed. Clay forms, perhaps more than other material forms, are seen as embodiment of this dialectical process, or as the product of such a dialogue. There is a paradox here, but also the solution of it. The paradox is that, with the possible exception of learning, skilled practices and their creations make little use of language. I don't mean that creation is mute, silent, or meaningless. Instead, what I have tried to show is that the creative transactions between makers and materials exceed the confines of a linguistically based notion of dialogue. The notion of dialogue, in the linguistically based meaning of the term, presuppose separate and identifiable voices with the capacity to occupy different positions and roles. However, in the context of creative material engagement, such positioning merges into a single voice of becoming and culminates in the haptic attentive unity of potter and clay. The language of clay is tactile rather than verbal. The dialogue between the potter and clay is based on haptic transactions, gestures, and movement. The potter needs to touch clay in a way that will elicit a response from it, that will in turn elicit a further response of the potter. Knowing how to touch clay is relatively easy. Knowing how to transact with clay is altogether a different challenge. During those tactile dialogic encounters, clay responds to touch like humans do. Actualizing this tactile mode of communication takes years to learn. Yet it is this affective interconnectedness between the maker and material that make skilled practices capable of speaking in the absence of language. This is also how I understand the meaning of material agency, not as a fixed capacity that a person or a thing has, but as the product of this mediated and situated transaction between them. So thank you very much for your attention. And before we move to the questions, I have a very brief film that was produced by our research assistant to the ESC grant research program, Maria Renee Kukuti, which I would like to share with you just to get a better sense of some of the issues we've been discussing. Just give me a moment to
Ora ho preti, per questo lavoro na caso visto l'artigliato. Però la stessa ora tanto se lo appoggiato ora se lo puoi stare. Io per il tradotto.
Vengono portative come Palermo, tanti oggi sono solo quando ci oggi che una classe, la risposta.
Come al mare, dopo che si passa.
Εδώ κοιτάς πολύ και είναι κάποια πράγματα.
Περνάμε έξω εδώ κατάληζεψαμε και μετά με παλεύει. Και ένα είναι και θα την αλήθεια δηλαδή ότι εγώ
Αυτό που θα φτιάξω τώρα θέλω να είναι το πιο ωραίο πόρτα που έχω κάνει στη ζωή μου.
Αυτό πάντα το λέτε.
Αυτό που θα κάνω να φτιάξω τώρα δεν θα είναι το πιο ωραίο πόρτα που έχω φτιάξει στη ζωή μου. Δεν ξέρω τώρα τι θα κάνω. Δεν είναι φτιάχνω.
Okay.